So this is what we are going to be talking about. So the question is, how long did postal workers live? And one of the things that we know from other research is that over time, in most European countries, people started living longer, but as they lived longer, there was also a higher incidence of sickness. We know that from different kind of records and different studies. And the same, in some senses, we know that as we age, we tend to get bouts of illness. When we look at the post office workforce, which we've done in our previous pilot studies, which were based just on 4 years worth of data, not the 50 years that we're looking at, what we found was that levels of sickness rose over time, but that depended very much on where people lived. So workers in cities took more time off than those in the countryside. We know that, and that's partly the type of work, but it's also partly the living conditions. But what we don't know is how long did those workers live once they retired? And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be doing that through a couple of stories. The first is the oldest postmistress in Britain, Mrs. Eliza Adamson. Some of you might have met her already. She was born in 1805. She died in 1898. She was working until she was 93. And Auchmithi, and I'm sorry if I've mispronounced that. Someone correct me later on, which was on the east coast of Scotland. The Dundee Courier interviewed her on February the 3rd, 1898, and described her. She was blessed with a cheery old body, a clear memory, and in spite of her remarkable age, excellent eyesight. And she was apparently the oldest postmistress in the entire UK. We can vouch that is the case. I've only found one example of a postmistress who is anywhere close to her. That was a postmistress in Ireland who was 86. There were quite a few in their 70s still working, but she was definitely the only one that we found who was still working in the into her 90s. And in recognition of that, her service, she received a generous gratuity from the Royal Bounty. Unfortunately, she died a few months later, so she couldn't really enjoy it very much. But that is Mrs. Adamson. Now, how typical was she? We can pick up another postmistress. This is Mrs. Elizabeth George. She is a postmistress from Tewkesbury. So this is down in the south in Gloucestershire, not up in the north. She was born in 1827. In the census of 1881, she was described as the postmaster's wife. The postmaster was Robert George. They had their post office was right in the centre of town in Tewkesbury, in Church Street, right next to the bank, close to the church. Unfortunately, her husband died in an accident when the horse and trap they were riding in, having visited their sub-post offices in their district, the horse bolted down a hill. He was thrown out of the carriage. He fractured his skull. He died the same day. She was uninjured, and it sounds like she then took over the post office, and she became the postmistress until she retired at the age of 72, having served 40 years in the post office and therefore qualified for the full pension. And when she retired, this is her pension entry, which you've actually transcribed. Whoever transcribed 1898, volume 182, page 127 would have come across Elizabeth George, postmistress of Tewkesbury. And in December of that year, she was given a diamond and sapphire ring by the grateful inhabitants of Tewkesbury. So again, she lived to a ripe old age. Certainly she was working into her 70s, and we have a pension record. Now, this pension record has been photographed, and I know it's not very clear on the screen. That's because it isn't actually very clear in real life. This is one of the pension records that we have paid to have photographed that will be released tomorrow on the Zooniverse platform. Harry later on can tell you a little bit more about that. These are the original records that we wanted to transcribe. There are about 30,000 of these tucked away in the Postal Museum. We can't get access to them because of the COVID, but we've managed to get some photographed by Louis, the Postal Museum's photographer. This is Elizabeth George. Basically, it shows you her name, when she retired. I know it's not very clear where she worked, how much she earned, how much was her pension, and so on and so on. It gives us the reason for her retirement, which in her case was just old age. And on the last page, you get this table, this one here. I'm just going to blow that up a little bit. This is the table, that the only information really that we cannot get from all the data linkage that Harry in particular has been doing, but Laura as well. This sickness table is the only thing that we cannot get. So this is what we're really interested in these pension records at the present time. This is Elizabeth Adamson. She had 10 years before she retired. Her sickness was recorded. And what we can see here is she actually had very few days off ill. This column shows you her illness record. And she only had one bout of illness in the 10 years, which was in 1896, when she had 34 days off sick. So if you average that out, she was having less than 4 days sickness a year, but actually all of those came in that 1 year. What we're trying to do with this is look at each year to see whether in general sickness levels were high or relatively low in any particular year. And once we have all our records transcribed and these sickness records transcribed, we'll be able to look at that. So for example, we know there were several bouts of influenza in the 1890s. It's the Russian flu. Did sickness rates rise in those years? Because if it did, we'll be able to pick that up with this kind of data. So this is Elizabeth Adamson's pension records. If you're really interested in seeing them in real life, tomorrow they will be released to the world. What happened to her? Let's just, well, I haven't been able to track down her death, but what we do know is that in 1911, aged 84, so she lived quite a long time, she was described as a widow. She was actually living with her nephew, George Morris, who was a sorting clerk, and she was described as a retired postmistress. She was living in Wales. I think that's Aberystwyth, but don't quote me on that. And actually, she clearly had a very good relationship with her nephew, because he had lived with her and her husband when he was alive back in Tewkesbury when he was a boy. So there was a family link, a long-term family link between George Morris, the nephew, and Elizabeth George, the aunt. So she lived a long time, just like Eliza Adamson. So the question is, how typical are these long-lived postmistresses? Are they unusual? Well, to answer that kind of question, we need to just get a sense of how many there were and where they are. This is a map that Harry produced very recently of the location of postmistresses and sub-postmistresses in Britain. They're dotted all over the place. They're quite often in rural or small towns in rural places like Tewkesbury or Auchmichie up here on the east coast. The dark dots where you see number 2 are where there was more than one postmistress recorded in our data. This is the data from 1860 to 1897, which comes partly from the transcriptions that you've made, which give us the place, and also linking that up to our parliamentary papers data, which we've been working on. But this is essentially mapping the pension index, showing you where the postmistresses were. So are they typical? So let's have a look. If we put the records that we've got so far together and we look at the ages of the postmistresses, and I'm just looking at postmistresses here, when did the postmistresses start work compared to other female employees? When did they retire? And how long did they live? Because we can work all this out from the data that we've joined together. So working our way from the left, the red is England and Wales, the green is Ireland, and the blue is Scotland. Postmistresses tended to start work in their 30s. Quite often they would be married or inherit it from one of their relatives. That was that was older than other workers, and many of these female workers would have been clerks and telegraphists who typically tended to start work much earlier. And you can see even here there's a gradient between England and Wales and Ireland and Scotland. Some of that was because there were many more telegraphists in England and Wales, mostly in London, but also large cities, and they tended to be younger than the rest of the female workers. So they started work later, postmistresses. They also retired a lot later. Most of them actually seemed to retire in their 60s. So they made it through, compared to those female workers in other occupations who actually tended to retire in their late 40s or in their late 50s. So we've got at least 5 or 6 years on average more working life for postmistresses than for the other workers, bearing in mind that they also started slightly younger. Did they live longer once they retired? Well, here are the ages, the average ages of death of postmistresses in our records in England, Ireland and Scotland. And you can see that most of them lived into their 70s. So from what we can see, Eliza Adamson, but also Eliza Adamson, but also Elizabeth George were up here. They were actually relatively old compared to some of the postmistresses. So we know that postmistresses also lived to quite ripe old ages, and they certainly lived longer than did the other postal workers. So they did well. What was that about, actually? And that's one of the questions that we can't necessarily answer, but it's an important one. One of the ways we can look at that is, were they typical of other similar kinds of workers? So in this slide, and I know there's a lot of information to take in, what we've looked at is the age of retirement of different groups of workers, and this is between 1860 and 1897. There are some gaps in our data, and this is only for the top set of occupations. We've looked at the age of retirement, which is shown here in the blue, and we've looked at the age of death, which we've worked out from the parliamentary papers. Here are the sub-postmasters. They are the male version of the women that we've been talking about. They tended to retire into their 70s, but they died in the late 70s. So they had about seven years extra life. If you were an inspector of letter carriers, and there clearly weren't that many inspectors, but this was a high status job, they retired much earlier and they lived quite a long time, well into their 70s. Postmasters, again, working into their 60s, a few more years of life left, 6 or 7 years of life there. There's your postmistresses, retiring in their early 60s, but living into their early 70s. These are the kind of top status jobs in the post office. Down at the other end, let me just there's our postmistresses there. Down at the other end are the workers like sorters and postmen. In most cases, these people did not reach retirement age. They retired in their 40s. You can see sorters in particular here, very common work, very common occupation in the post office. They didn't make it into their 50s, and they tended to die before they reached the age of 60. Postmen also, they retired usually by the time they'd reached 50. In most cases, this was because of ill health, and they didn't live very long. They only lived 3 or 4 years on average before they died. The lower status job, so we have sorting clerks, traveling sorters. These are people who sorted on the railways, the sorting clerks and telegraphists. These are relatively low paid, and there's your telegraphist down here. These are people who tended to retire early, and they didn't live that long. So you've got a status gradient. The postmistresses, postmasters, the inspectors, all up here, working into their late 50s, into their 60s, and then enjoying quite a long retirement period. But down here, the sorters and the mail, the people who delivered the mail, not having such a good post-retirement phase. Okay, I'm coming to the end of the talk, but I just wanted to throw in a different way of looking at the data and the kind of questions that we go through before we try and reach an answer. I took all the workers in the United Kingdom, and then I broke it down by Ireland, England and Wales and Scotland. This is based on work that Laura and Harry have been doing. So I'm just the swan on top. They've been doing the really hard work. This is the age of retirement on a year-by-year basis for all workers in the United Kingdom from 1861 to 1898. This is the age of death for those workers. There are about 4,000 in our sample at present. And what we can see is that in the 1880s, it looks like the age of death starts to drop. And it looks like over time, the age of retirement of our workers also starts to drop. Now, what's the reason for this? I mean, it's being driven largely by England and Wales, but the same is true of Ireland. You can see down here, the age of the workforce when they retire tends to be dropping from the 1880s, and their age of death is also coming down. Same is true of Scotland, with that exception there. In general, it's coming down. What is the reason for this? This is workers retiring earlier as we go on through the century, but also seeming to die earlier. Well, we think there are possibly 4 reasons. And this is the first time that anybody has actually seen this data, including the team. Was the workforce getting sicker as a whole? Was it retiring earlier because of that ill health? And therefore, were people dying earlier? The trouble with that is that we know that life expectancy, adult life expectancy, was actually going up. So people were living longer in general once they survived childhood. And so why was there something different about our workforce? I don't know the answer to that, but it's a hypothesis. Alternatively, was there a growing proportion of the workforce in those lower status occupations like sorters and postmen? And we know that their health outcomes were worse than the upper group. So was the workforce changing in a way that concentrated those less fortunate occupations compared to the healthier ones? We don't know the answer to that. It's a hypothesis. Or perhaps there was a cohort effect. The people who were retiring in the 1890s who were around about 50 years old had been born in the so-called Hungry 40s, when times were particularly hard. So they didn't get very good childhood nutrition. So was it that we've got a cohort of workers who were working their way through the post office who were actually less healthy? And again, we don't know that, but it's something that we can look for when we've got our full set of data. Or finally, could it be that it's just an artifact of our data? That actually, as you get into the 1880s and 90s, it becomes more difficult to trace through those people in our sample through to their deaths because we haven't quite finished our data collection yet. Again, it could just be that it's that we haven't quite worked out our data yet. But all of these are reasonable questions to ask, thrown up by looking at our data as it comes in, as we begin to analyze it. We will get the answer to this eventually, but it's going to take us a bit more time. But I thought it'd be interesting for us to show you the processes that we go through and the kind of questions we ask of the data that you are helping us accumulate. Finally, and I'm going to end this now, this is the final slide. These are actually slides, pictures circulating at the time of postal workers. So do we have, on the one hand, the hale and hearty postman delivering the mail in all weathers, or do we have the poor overburdened postman having to carry heavier loads over longer distances because people were sending more mail through the post and there wasn't enough staff to deal with them, a bit like our poor overworked Royal Mail deliverers and couriers today. So we don't have the answer to which one of these is the correct, if there is a correct image, but I thought it would be a nice way to end this talk on longevity in the post office.